Welcome to the All Things Nintendo podcast. I'm Brian Shea, and this is a weekly podcast to discuss all the biggest news and games from the world of Nintendo. As you are listening to this, I am out in San Francisco at the Game Developers Conference representing Game Informer. So this is a pre-recorded episode of the podcast. Apologies for any big news that happens as this episode is airing, but I promise you we will play catch up next week. However, speaking of the last few weeks, during the Making of Pokemon episode, you may remember that I mentioned that the end of February was also the 40th anniversary of The Legend of Zelda, which just so happens to be my favorite video game franchise of all time. So as I mentioned in that episode, I wanted to do something to commemorate such an incredible milestone for one of the most important and beloved franchises of all time. So like we typically do on this podcast, I am going to share a little bit of the behind the scenes story of how this series was made and then highlight some of the most important milestones in the franchise's history. So because this is such an information-dense episode, this episode's just going to be me, and I will do my best to try and keep it interesting, and who knows, maybe you'll even learn something. It is, after all, my favorite franchise in all of video games. And also, I know we've talked a lot about Pokemon in recent weeks, so if that is not your thing, which I understand it is not everybody's thing, but February was a big month for Pokemon, and obviously the beginning of March last week with Pokopia coming out. So if that isn't your thing, I appreciate you sticking it out as we had basically a full month of Pokemon-centric episodes. I also, a little bit of a production note here. I know we are still on Nintendo Direct Watch, and they have in the past, I think, done one around Game Developers Conference. So knowing my luck, that happened this week, and now I'm going to have to do a big catch-up episode. But hopefully that is not the case, and or at least for this podcast's sake. I know everybody here is hoping for a Nintendo Direct, at least a first-party Nintendo Direct. So if anything big did happen, we will absolutely catch it next week when that episode hits. So thanks so much for bearing with me as I am traveling to GDC for my job at Game Informer. So we're going to talk all about The Legend of Zelda with an emphasis on the first game and the creation of the franchise, but also the important figures in Zelda history and some of the milestones that the Zelda franchise has experienced over its 40-year history, which is so wild to me. I mean, we're going to get into it in this episode here. It's just going to be a single segment, and I think that there's a lot of cool stuff to discuss, but there's a lot of information, which is why I'm going it alone here, because I always feel like when I have somebody on this podcast and I'm just kind of rattling off like the making of, it feels like I'm lecturing them, and I'm not a professor. I'm not a teacher. I don't want to lecture anybody. But I guess if you are listening to this podcast, you're signing up for a lecture. So, so we're going to jump into that in just a moment. Before we get to that, a reminder that this show is brought to you by the wonderful folks who support me on Patreon. Without them, this show literally would not exist. You can get access to the community Discord for as little as $3 a month, but there are also $5 and $10 tiers that get you things like early and ad-free episodes, plus shout-outs at the end of every show. We also do community nights from time to time, so that's been super fun. We played Mario Kart World. We played Kirby Air Riders. Who knows what we're going to play next time? We need to wait for a game that has enough of a mass appeal, but also large multiplayer sessions. So we'll keep an eye on that. Maybe we'll do Super Smash Bros. Ultimate at some point, but there's always plenty of games on offer. But you can join the team that makes this show happen by going to patreon.com and searching for Brian Shea or All Things Nintendo. It is only because of the fine folks who support this podcast on Patreon that I'm able to keep going week after week as an independent entity. So with that preamble out of the way, let's just get into the creation and legacy of the Legend of Zelda franchise. And again, apologies that the month of February and the first week of March was kind of consumed by Pokemania. I know that the Legend of Zelda franchise turned 40 years old on February 21st, but that just so happened to be the Pokemon 30th anniversary, and I thought that was a better lead-in to the Pokemon Day festivities, which is why I pushed the Zelda franchise retrospective to this week. So I hope you don't mind too much that we're a few weeks late on the anniversary topic, but much like we covered in that Pokemon episode, The Legend of Zelda was actually inspired by its creator's childhood hobbies. So, as a kid in Sonobe, Japan, sorry, I butchered that, which is kind of like the countryside of Kyoto, a young child named Shigeru Miyamoto would explore the hillsides and the forests and the caves and all the nature areas, the parks around his house. And he had a blast doing this. He would go on little adventures. There was one time where he kind of felt like he got lost, so he was thinking like, oh, it'd be really helpful to have a map here. And there's another time where he had to like will his way into like forcing himself to step inside of a cave opening that he found. And he always thought that this was a really cool idea for a story. And, these activities inspired Miyamoto years and years later to create a video game based on the experience. And this is why a lot of the versions of Link are actually young boys. And Miyamoto wanted to create what he called miniature gardens for players with each game in the series. So in the early 70s, Miyamoto attended the Kanazawa Municipal College of Industrial Arts, graduating with an industrial design degree. And originally, he was actually going to pursue a career as a manga artist, which is funny because I believe there's like several of the early like godfathers of these major franchises that wanted to be artists. I think Takashi Tezuka, who is the head of Sonic Team, he's been kind of like the overseeing Sonic Team since Yuji Naka left Sonic Team during development of Sonic '06. But even before that, he was a lead designer and director. He was lead designer on Sonic 3 and director of the Sonic Adventure games and the creator of Shadow and everything. He also wanted to be a manga artist from when I did my profile on Takashi Tezuka. But Shigeru Miyamoto, wanted to be a manga artist, but then he joined Nintendo, which at the time was primarily a toy manufacturer. And Miyamoto's father actually had a mutual friend with Hiroshi Yamauchi, who was president of Nintendo at the time. And Miyamoto brought some ideas for some toys, and in this kind of informal meet and greet with Yamauchi, and they actually impressed Yamauchi, and he hired Miyamoto as an apprentice within Nintendo's planning department. So, as I mentioned, Miyamoto grew up as a big fan of manga, but also Western media. And that includes TV and music from the US. And he was a huge fan of bluegrass. And he, in subsequent years, has even learned how to play banjo. And you can definitely hear, even though Miyamoto's not the composer of these games, you can hear Miyamoto's love of banjo and bluegrass in the soundtrack of games like Super Mario World. If you ever play that, like there's a lot of banjo in that soundtrack. I don't know how much that was Miyamoto's call versus how much that was Koji Kondo's call, but in the chronology of this rundown of the history, we are a long way away from 1991. So let's get back to the Zelda topic here. So Miyamoto was hired to help create toys at Nintendo, but he eventually developed an interest in creating video games after he went to an arcade and he played Space Invaders in 1978. And at the time, Miyamoto was still an aspiring artist, so his first gaming role was actually creating art for a 1979 game that Nintendo put out in arcades called Sheriff. And around that time, Nintendo was also working on a game called Radar Scope, and it came out in 1980 in arcades, and it was, relatively successful in Japan, but it was a massive flop in Western markets. And Hiroshi Yamauchi was really discouraged by that, but he was like, well, we've got to do something with these unsold radar scope cabinets. So he started thinking of ways they could convert them into something that could sell within the US. And I found an interview with Miyamoto, and the way he recalled it, he basically said like, yeah, nobody else was available to work on it. So they gave it to one of the new guys. So basically threw this task at Miyamoto, and they put Gunpei Yokoi, who I've talked about in previous episodes as someone who probably belongs on the Nintendo Mount Rushmore alongside folks like Miyamoto and a few of the other people we're going to be talking about in this episode. So Gunpei Yokoi was assigned to oversee this project where Miyamoto was kind of the front man of creating a game that they could use to convert these radar scope cabinets that would sell in the West. So we won't dwell too much on this since I'm mostly here to talk about Zelda. But in case you didn't know, Miyamoto originally wanted to use Popeye characters with Bluto kidnapping Olive Oil and then Popeye climbing through a construction area to save her. And unfortunately for them at the time, but fortunately, ultimately, Nintendo couldn't get the rights to Popeye. So Miyamoto took that idea and made something new, turning Bluto into a giant ape named Donkey Kong, Olive Oil into Pauline, and Popeye into a mustachioed man named Jumpman. Later, he would become known as Mario. And Miyamoto added sloped paths, ladders, and barrels for obstacles. And not only were Donkey Kong and the man who would go on to become Mario born, but so was Miyamoto's career as a game designer. So Donkey Kong just was a massive success, right? We still talk about it to this day. And that led to Miyamoto creating Donkey Kong Jr. and Donkey Kong 3. And then Miyamoto ended up naming Jumpman Mario and gave him a brother named Luigi as he was beginning work on a competitive multiplayer arcade game simply called Mario Brothers. And he was fascinated with New York and the setting of New York. And so he took inspiration from New York's sewer system, which is why the game takes place in a sewer with pipes and animals coming out. So around that time in 1984, a man named Takashi Tezuka joined Nintendo as a part-time sprite artist while he finished working on his degree at Osaka University of Arts. So Tezuka was originally planning to work in advertising, but the more he thought about it, the more he just wasn't a fan of having to create things to a client's specifications. He wanted to be creative and create stuff that he wanted to create. But he had a friend who happened to work at Nintendo, which sparked Tezuka's idea of working on stuff that was, designed for recreation and leisure. So he didn't have basically any knowledge about gaming. And I found an article on The Gamer saying that he hadn't even heard of Pac-Man before joining Nintendo, to show how out of the loop Tezuka was in the gaming space. So Tezuka began work on sprites for the first Punch-Out game before graduating college, and then he joined the company as a full-time employee. And his first full-time project was called Devil World, which was Miyamoto's first console exclusive game. And Devil World is actually interesting for the fact that it was the first time Miyamoto, Tezuka, and then a young composer named Koji Kondo all worked together. But it's also unique in that it actually never came to the US due to Nintendo's concerns about how it depicts religion. Like there's some religious symbols in there. And then we would later see that concern actually come back and impact a few other games, most notably, I think, for this conversation at the very least. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which accidentally included a religious chant for the Fire Temple, which anytime they've released that game or when they did an extra run of Ocarina of Time, they removed it and put different music in there for subsequent releases. So after finishing work on Devil World, and by the way, Devil World did ultimately come to Nintendo Switch Online. So if you would like to check out this first collaboration between all of these legends, you can go check it out on Nintendo Switch Online if you have a subscription. So came out 1984 on the Famicom, and Miyamoto, Tezuka, and Koji Kondo started talking about making what Miyamoto referred to at the time as an athletic game, which would involve what we now know as platforming. So different from platforming games at the time, they wanted to allow the screen to scroll. So it wasn't just a single screen platforming experience. And then they wanted to add brighter colors than most games had at the time. So using the scrolling engine that Miyamoto and his team originally developed for Excitebike, the team developed a successor to Mario Brothers called Super Mario Brothers. And Miyamoto actually viewed Super Mario Bros. This is a funny tidbit that I found. He viewed this as the last hurrah for cartridge-based gaming because he thought the Famicom disk system, which Nintendo was also getting ready to launch, he thought that was the future. And so they were conceptualizing a game alongside Super Mario Brothers that would kind of be the big selling game for the Famicom disk system. So this game that Miyamoto was working on alongside Super Mario Brothers, along with Koji Kondo and Takashi Tezuka, was tentatively called Death Mountain, based on some sources that I found. And Miyamoto and Tezuka would co-direct it. Miyamoto wanted to pull from those childhood experiences I mentioned before, where he, explore nature, and then he wanted to build an entire narrative around it. So he tasked Tezuka with developing the story and setting, which Tezuka did by pulling inspiration from fantasy books like The Lord of the Rings for the setting. And then King Arthur stories eventually would influence the story of the series because of the notion of a legendary weapon that can combat evil. So Pulling from his love of American media, Miyamoto thought of American novelist and wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald, Zelda Fitzgerald, because he knew the name and he thought it sounded, quote, pleasant and significant. So he chose that for the princess's name in this game. And since the game was originally planned to, kind of feel like a fairy tale, they decided to call it The Legend of Zelda instead of Death Mountain, which ended up being a location in these games. So there's a book by in 2006 from an author named Todd Mawat, and it's called Game On, Shigeru Miyamoto. And he has a quote from Shigeru Miyamoto here. It says, quote, Zelda was the wife of famous novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald. She was a famous and beautiful woman from all accounts, and I liked the sound of her name, so I took the liberty of using it for the very first title. And meanwhile, Tezuka drew inspiration from Disney's Peter Pan for the main character's appearance, and they called the protagonist Link to signal that the character is the thing that links the player to the world of the game. And that's also the reason that Link has very rarely talked, or to this point, mostly been completely silent, aside from like his grunts and all those noises that he makes. So originally, Koji Kondo wanted to use a composition from Maurice Ravel called Bolero as kind of like the main theme of this game. But since it wasn't yet in public domain in Japan, he was concerned, and Nintendo's legal counsel was concerned that this that they would get in hot water, like legal hot water for using it. So they told Koji Kondo he needed to create something new. And, the deadlines were happening fast. So Kondo actually needed to do it really, really quick. So this is like a few months before launch. And Koji Kondo created what we now know as the main Zelda overworld theme in just one day. And he composed the other 4 songs in the game as well. So most of the programming of this original Legend of Zelda was done by Toshihiko Nakago, and Keiji Terui, who Terui actually previously worked on the Dragon Ball anime, and he helped write the backstory for the instruction manual, which he drew inspiration from wars from like the Europe's medieval times. And since the team developed Super Mario Brothers and The Legend of Zelda side by side, Miyamoto wanted them to play completely different while still being experiences that are more about making it through the game rather than focusing on high scores. So, Super Mario Brothers was almost entirely linear. Obviously, there's exploration elements for like going into pipes, finding warp zones, stuff like that. But, you're basically starting at one point, going to the flagpole, going left to right. That is what Miyamoto wanted for that game. On the other hand, The Legend of Zelda, super open-ended, and it also plays into the original theme of childhood exploration of nature. And in a 2007 speech that Miyamoto gave at the Game Developers Conference, Miyamoto was actually concerned that Japanese players would have trouble, having such little guidance in a game, to the point that he was concerned that players in Japan wouldn't even find that sword in the initial cave. So they kicked around the idea of actually starting Link with the sword in his inventory. But instead, Miyamoto decided that he actually liked the idea of forcing players to talk to the old man in the cave, and then expanding the idea of not only having players needing to talk to other NPCs to learn about secrets around the world, but he also wanted to encourage players to like talk to other real life human beings who have been playing the game so they can share secrets with each other. So it kind of like was creating this like virality as we know it today, but way before the internet existed. And Miyamoto pulled from his experience of exploring different rooms of his family's house in Sonobe to create these like maze-like dungeons that we see in the game. So that was where that came from, alongside the inspiration of caves. And he was also particularly fond of RPG style progression. So he wanted to implement some sort of thing where characters would become stronger over the course of the adventure. And unfortunately, while programming the game, Nakago only ended up using half of the dungeon pieces that Miyamoto helped create within the world, which led to the idea of a second quest that unlocked after players beat the original story. So that's why we have those reconfigured dungeons in the game. So The Legend of Zelda released in Japan on February 21st, 1986 as a launch title for the Famicom Disk System. And it was noteworthy because the fact that the Famicom Disk System used rewritable disks, it was the first time that it allowed a player to save their progress. And it also allowed extra audio quality for because it had an extra channel that could be utilized for some sound effects. And I don't think that most people know this, but the Famicom Disk System, when you had it, the controller, true to Nintendo, had a microphone on the controller, and you could blow into it or shout into it. And there was actually a rabbit, kind of like a rabbit-inspired monster that could be defeated by yelling into the controller or blowing into it, just creating some sort of noise to defeat it. And unfortunately, the Famicom Disk System ended up failing and Nintendo discontinued it. So Nintendo ended up porting it to the regular cartridge Famicom, and the sounds had to be edited so they could work on a cartridge, and they removed the microphone feature, including the enemy that was defeated through that microphone feature. And to fit everything on the cartridge, Nintendo ended up using a special memory management chip that would allow the RAM to switch between memory banks on the fly. That gave Nintendo, Miyamoto, Tezuka, the entire team more memory to use. So that it was just a completely different approach that they've used in past games. And Nintendo also, because they were like, well, we no longer have the Famicom Disk System, how are we going to add save files? They didn't want to implement a password system as was common back then. They instead wanted to create some sort of memory save file system. And so they did that using battery powered RAM, which, again, for the first time ever, players could save their data across multiple play sessions on the NES. The Legend of Zelda, very critically well received. And when it was released in Japan, it sold more than 1.5 million units for the Famicom Disk System. And then when Nintendo brought The Legend of Zelda to the US, they used a special gold-colored cartridge. And that version arrived in the US in August 22nd, 1987. And there was actually a good deal of hype when it came to the US. And it actually shot to the top of the charts pretty quickly. And it sold more than 3 million copies in the first 3 years, which was a ton back then. And overall, The Legend of Zelda sold more than 6.5 million copies worldwide. And in terms of accolades, in 2001 and then again in 2009, Game Informer named it the greatest video game of all.
Raise the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. Start converting your B2B audience today. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started today at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
Time. And also, getting into a little bit of the legacy here, coinciding with the release of The Legend of Zelda in the US, Nintendo started a magazine called The Fun Club, which was kind of this way that players could get tips and secrets about the games that they're playing, and kind of new releases and, cheat codes and how to find secrets and where to go after certain confusing things. And since Zelda was both, popular, but also sometimes confusing, this magazine kept growing in popularity. And I think in the US, they actually included a 6-month membership for the Fun Club. And then you could choose to renew that or discontinue it. But it turns out that a lot of people were using it because there were so many things that were kind of cryptic in this first Zelda game. And since it was becoming so popular, they decided to rebrand it and turn it into an actual official magazine, which ended up being called Nintendo Power Magazine. And as wild as it is that Nintendo Power may be a part of The Legend of Zelda's legacy, it is, not anywhere near the biggest part of its legacy. Over the last 40 years, I think it's fair to say that nearly every action game, and I would even say a lot of role-playing games, have been inspired by one of the Legend of Zelda games. Without Zelda, there's no Dark Souls, there's no Elden Ring, there's no Ghost of Tsushima. I would even say Red Dead Redemption, there's none of that. There's no God of War, there's no Assassin's Creed, there's no Witcher, probably no Skyrim. But if Zelda never existed, this first Legend of Zelda never existed, I would say the biggest impact on the games industry, and this is circular logic, so bear with me, but we wouldn't have all that came after it within the series itself. So just like, all of these subsequent Legend of Zelda games would just not exist if we didn't have this one, which I think would just be a massive blow to the industry as we know it now. So I'm not going to get into the rest of the series in that that level of detail. Otherwise, this would probably be like a 5-6 hour podcast. But, shortly after the release of the original Legend of Zelda, Nintendo began work on a sequel. This time it was Miyamoto producing, Tezuka writing, and Tadashi Sugiyama and Yasuhisa Yamamura directing. And that game was Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. It ended up changing a ton about the formula, which was at the direction of Miyamoto. It pulled side-scrolling elements from Kung Fu Master, RPG elements from Dragon Quest. Those are listed specifically as some of the key influences for Zelda 2, which ended up arriving on the Japanese Famicom Disk System in 1987, and then on the NES in the US in December 1988. And, people usually look back at Zelda 2 as kind of a black sheep of the series, but it was actually well received at the time. And it ended up selling nearly 4.5 million copies across the globe. So about 2 million fewer than the original Zelda, but still a huge success. And I would say, today it's looked back mostly negative, but Nintendo absolutely course corrected with much of the rest of the series if you're concerned about not having that core formula intact. Around the release of Zelda 2 in 1988, a young Tokyo University of the Arts graduate joined Nintendo as a designer. And that graduate was named Eiji Aonuma. And when he interviewed at Nintendo, similar to Tezuka, he wasn't even a gamer at that point. And instead, his girlfriend actually introduced him to gaming through the Dragon Quest series on Famicom. And then there was also a PC game called Portopia Serial Murder. Portopia Serial Murder Case, sorry. And when he started at Nintendo, his job was to create sprites for NES Open Tournament Golf. And after doing a few smaller projects, doing graphic design, Shigeru Miyamoto actually reached out to Aonuma and asked him to join the Zelda team. But we would not see Aonuma's work on the Zelda franchise for quite a while after this. So first up, in 1991, Takashi Tezuka stepped back into the director role for a game that many people have considered the greatest video game of all time, and that is The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. And there's several of these games in this Zelda lineage that I've done entire episodes on. So you can go back and listen to my Link to the Past episode. It's actually several years ago at this point. It was one of the first retrospectives I've done. So if you go to the archives, or search for it on whatever feed you're listening to this on, you can probably find that. I believe it was former Game Informer editor Dan Tack joining me for that episode, because he was on that train before Elden Ring came out, that Link to the Past was the greatest game ever made. But that's not an unpopular opinion. It's still one of the most perfect games of all time. And this was also around the time that Takashi Tezuka really started emerging as a star within Nintendo. So in very short order, he would go on to direct Super Mario Bros. 3, Zelda: A Link to the Past, Zelda: Link's Awakening, Super Mario World, and Yoshi's Island. All of those are Takashi Tezuka directed games. And all of those, I think, if you listed out the 50 greatest games of all time, they are all either locks or in the conversation to be included. So just a murderer's row of resume builders there if you're following Takashi Tezuka's career. So Link's Awakening, which I just mentioned, in 1993 was another major milestone for the Zelda franchise because it was the first time the game made the leap to handhelds. That game actually originally began as a side project by a programmer named Kazuaki Morita. And he started working it as a port of A Link to the Past to the Game Boy, but it slowly started ballooning into a bigger thing. And he started recruiting other developers at Nintendo to work on it after hours because he was like, hey, I think we have something cool here. And eventually that included Tezuka and Miyamoto. And, after the release of A Link to the Past, they were kind of freed up a little bit. And originally, that was going to be the plan to port A Link to the Past to the Game Boy, but that proved too difficult. So they pivoted to make something new. And I asked Takashi Tezuka in 2019, back when I was interviewing him for, I believe it was Super Mario Maker 2, but A Link's Awakening remake was also being promoted at the time. This was at E3 2019, which was the final in-person E3 to ever take place. I asked him why he actually prefers Link's Awakening over A Link to the Past, and he actually said it came down to those technical limitations. Here's his quote. I felt there was actually real meaning in the fact that we were able to make the game on the Game Boy. It was really fun to take on the challenge of trying to make a game for the Game Boy since its technical classifications were much lower than that of the Super Nintendo. Taking on that challenge was particularly exciting. This game is also, speaking of like just the all-stars of all-stars at Nintendo, this is when Yoshiaki Koizumi stepped into the designer role. So he joined in 1991. And Koizumi has gone on to design Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and he's also directed Super Mario Sunshine, Super Mario Galaxy. He produced Galaxy 2, Super Mario 3D World, and Super Mario Odyssey. So yeah, he has had his hands in so many games. Also, they in that game, Link's Awakening, there was a huge weird thing because it's dream logic taking place in that game. And you see a lot of Nintendo characters that are not from the Zelda franchise. And Aonuma and Tezuka mentioned that to me, that was kind of like, the Wild West of game development, where they're just like throwing stuff into it and not necessarily having the permission. When I asked Aonuma, did you get permission this time when they made the remake for Switch? He said, yeah, we made sure to get permission for any of the cameos that we had this time around. So that was an interesting tidbit from that conversation. So speaking of Ocarina of Time, that actually proved to be somehow maybe as important, if not more, than the original Legend of Zelda. And I think if you look back at that era with Ocarina of Time coming out in 1998, every 3D platforming game, I would say, was inspired by Super Mario 64, while every other 3D action game was inspired by Ocarina of Time. And this is another one of those games that I have an entire episode devoted to. So if you'd like to go back and find that, that is where you'll find more information on the development of Ocarina of Time. But this is extremely important because this is when we finally saw the emergence of Eiji Aonuma within the Zelda franchise. And, I've talked to Aonuma 3 times now. And in my conversations with Aonuma, he's told me that Link's Awakening served as his biggest influence when he began designing and directing within the Zelda franchise. This is a quote from that same E3 where I talked to Tezuka. Here's Aonuma in 2019 saying, quote, "When I was playing Link's Awakening, I was very influenced by what that game offered. It definitely transferred to the other Zelda games I developed. I was recently playing through it and everything felt very nostalgic. I was like, oh, right, this is something I took and maybe incorporated into Ocarina of Time. There were a lot of things like that where I was inspired." And this is also, the first time that Aonuma truly collaborated with Shigeru Miyamoto. Miyamoto overseeing it as, I believe he was director on Ocarina of Time and Aonuma being lead designer. And in my 2019 interview with Aonuma, I asked him, like, what's it like collaborating with Shigeru Miyamoto? And he kind of lit up. He said, one thing that has definitely changed is that in the beginning, I had to create a bunch of things on my own. Now I have a great team with great people with different skills to help me create things together. And, he lit up saying, it's very interesting that you bring up Mr. Miyamoto. I've never thought of it as collaborating with him. Now that you've phrased it that way, I think, working with Mr. Miyamoto is a collaboration. That's kind of exciting. So it's hilarious that was 2019. So, that is 31 years after Aonuma joined Nintendo full time. And, he's probably gone to dinner with Miyamoto. He's probably done all kinds of stuff hanging out with Shigeru Miyamoto. And even 31 years into his career, he mentioned the idea of collaborating with somebody as legendary as Shigeru Miyamoto is exciting to him, even though he is, now the head honcho of this franchise. So Ocarina of Time is another one of those games that people often point to as perhaps the greatest video game of all time. And thanks in large part it's 3D action. It was incredibly novel at the time, and for many years it was the best example of a 3D action game feeling good and looking good. And every other 3D action game was basically forced to copy its homework since it was so far beyond everything else in that space. And Ocarina of Time, I touched on this on the devoted episode. It pioneered Z targeting, which was the dev team came up with it when they were at an amusement park doing research for a potential Zelda game. And they were thinking of doing it as a first person game, maybe we would have sword fighting in first person, but then they ducked inside during like a hot summer day at an amusement park, and there was a ninja show on stage, and a character was surrounded by enemies, and he took on a bunch of them at once by facing them and circling them and sometimes attaching a rope to remain locked onto them. And that was the convention that they used in almost every third-person action game to this day. I mentioned, Dark Souls and Elden Ring. When you click the stick and it locks onto that character, that was started in Ocarina of Time. And in 2023, when I asked Aonuma how he looks back on Ocarina of Time today, he said, quote, "I think with Ocarina of Time, that was us establishing The Legend of Zelda as a 3D game. Mr. Miyamoto was the director of that title, and then I kind of took the baton from him, and then it was my task to take that form that we had established with Ocarina of Time and then carry it forward. Then, in working with Mr. Fujibayashi in Skyward Sword, I had at that point been involved with the series for quite a while, and the job became, how do we take what we've established until that point and create something new and carry that series forward?" That process has continued through to Breath of the Wild. So that's just like kind of the lineage from Ocarina of Time to the modern Zelda games. So Aonuma continues, "When you're thinking about the legacy of a game like Ocarina of Time, there's been a flow that feels natural to us on the development team, of one creator to another, one game to another, that has taken us all the way to Tears of the Kingdom. I think that legacy and the momentum of that legacy will see us through to future titles going forward as well." And after Ocarina of Time, the hits just kept coming. Majora's Mask coming out after just 1 year of development, using the same engine and mostly the same assets as Ocarina of Time, but creating, a completely unique experience using time travel and time loops. And the series continued from there with games like the Oracle titles on Game Boy Color, the Wind Waker, which I've also done a full episode on. I did that a few years back. Twilight Princess, not to mention the Wind Waker DS follow-ups like Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks. And then in 2005, a former Capcom designer named Hidemaro Fujibayashi, who Aonuma, had mentioned in the quote that I just read, joined Nintendo. And while at Capcom, he actually served as director of Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons, Four Swords, and the Minish Cap. So naturally, Nintendo, when he joined the team, was basically like, hey, go work on the Zelda team. So he sub-directed Phantom Hourglass as his first project, and he also wrote the story of the game. But his first huge responsibility came in the form of what Aonuma referenced, which is Fujibayashi was the director of Skyward Sword on Wii. And Skyward Sword was Fujibayashi's first directorial role at Nintendo as a Nintendo employee. And it was also the first Zelda game where a studio called Monolith Soft supported with development. So Skyward Sword brought us into the motion control era of the series, and it really feels like it laid a lot of groundwork, not only for the narrative, but also the gameplay conventions that the team would explore in future entries. And this was also so consequential in terms of the story that it inspired the Zelda team to create an official timeline where Skyward Sword served as the starting point of the entire overarching Zelda franchise, before Ocarina of Time served as kind of a branching point that shifted the timeline to 3 separate paths depending on what happens to Link in the final battle against Ganon. So the timeline was officially canonized in 2011 in Japan alongside Skyward Sword in a book called Hyrule Historia, which eventually was published in the US in 2013. And I asked Aonuma and Fujibayashi about their approach to the timeline during my second chat with the duo in 2023. And here's what Fujibayashi had to say. Quote, "We realize that fans have a great time theorizing and enjoy thinking about where things fit on the timeline. That's something that the development team recognizes and it considers, but to an extent. I say to an extent because if we get too in the weeds or too detailed in that placement, it results in kind of creating restraints for our creativity. The process of creating new ideas becomes restricted because we're so tied up and trying to make things fit into a very specific spot in the timeline. We do consider it, but not to an extent where we feel that our development process feels restricted or constrained. So also hitting in 2013 alongside the Hyrule Historia in the US, a game called A Link Between Worlds was a long-awaited sequel to A Link to the Past, and may actually be one of the best overall Zelda games, even though it's never been freed from this prison of the 3DS's library. And outside of Triforce Heroes and HD remasters like Majora's Mask 3D and Twilight Princess HD, the series was actually pretty quiet for a bit. Everyone was waiting for this game that was being teased as like the next 3D mainline Zelda game. And, they were slowly teasing that this was going to be a reinvention of the franchise. But since we got so many remasters and ports during that stretch, I actually asked Aonuma about his philosophy in remaking, remastering, and porting older Zelda games back in 2019. And here's what he had to say. He said, quote, "I think why Zelda does get remade or remastered or ported a lot is because there's no one game style or art style. Every time there's a different art style or different gameplay. There's so much variety. So when we remake, they originally have all these different elements, but we can keep on incorporating new elements and introduce new gameplay or new excitement into these games. So when I create a remake or reimagining of a Zelda game, I always incorporate something new or fresh." And he ended up pointing out look, like with Link's Awakening remake, there's this dungeon creator and all this other, like the ability to map more buttons because your Switch controller has more buttons than the Game Boy did. So it's easier and better quality of life improvements in that regard. And also a lot more power, obviously.
Refreshing wild cherry cola meets smooth cream. The treat you deserve. Pepsi Wild Cherry and Cream. Treat yourself.
So that reinvention that we were promised, 6 years earlier, finally arrived after several delays in the form of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which was also directed by Fujibayashi and supported by Monolith Soft. So a lot of the team that worked on Skyward Sword ended up working on Breath of the Wild. And the game took the original concept of the original Legend of Zelda game, where you could go and explore however you wanted, and brought it into the modern era. There was actually a prototype for Breath of the Wild that used Zelda 1's NES graphics to lay out areas and just kind of get the conceptual elements down. And obviously they took that in a completely different direction, kind of making it more like anime or a little bit cell shaded in some regards, but very anime inspired. I would say very Studio Ghibli inspired. And it ended up completely flipping the franchise on its head while still somehow remaining extremely true to the Zelda formula. And I asked Fujibayashi and Aonuma about that in 2023. And they said, here's what Fujibayashi said. He said, quote, "When we're talking about this, I guess the essence of Zelda, as long as we preserve that, then I think it provides us with the freedom to really build Zelda. And it can become many different things. For example, it could be a puzzle game, an adventure game, or an action game. All of these moments that can be dropped into a game help it become a Zelda-like game as long as that essence is preserved. I think even with Breath of the Wild, there are big changes in the core gameplay mechanics, but that essence was still preserved. Likewise, with Tears of the Kingdom, we're really providing players with the freedom to use their creativity to come up with solutions. So that nervousness or doubt about whether this is okay isn't something we were really worried about. What we really are focused on is that through experimentation, making sure that the gameplay experience is something that is enjoyable and fun, and then taking that and making sure that the essence of Zelda is still alongside that. That is what I think makes it important. And that's a field that the Zelda team really has a lot of confidence in. So just as The Legend of Zelda influenced nearly every top-down action game in the 80s, how Ocarina of Time influenced every 3D action game in the 90s and 2000s, Breath of the Wild has kind of become another in the long line of extremely influential games from the series. And it was also a rare game in the series that got a full sequel in the form of Tears of the Kingdom, which was also directed by Fujibayashi and supported by Monolith. And it continued the story, focusing on Ganondorf, and introduced new abilities. And most notably, those new abilities included Ultra Hand, which calls back to one of the toys that Miyamoto's mentor, who we mentioned earlier, Gunpei Yokoi, invented in the late 60s. So it's safe to say that the Legend of Zelda franchise has been one of the most important franchises in gaming history. Like I said in the middle there are so many games that would not exist if it wasn't for those pivotal Zelda titles. But, if someone snapped their fingers and suddenly the Zelda games never existed, but I somehow retained my knowledge of them, I think I would miss the follow-ups to the original Zelda the most. Games like Ocarina of Time, like Wind Waker, like A Link to the Past, like Breath of the Wild. I would miss those games most of all, even more than the other games that the original Zelda inspired. And I know I did my top 50 games episode of all time just a few months ago, but just to recap where the Zelda games fell on that list for me, I put Wind Waker at 41. I put A Link to the Past at 27. A Link Between Worlds was at 18. Tears of the Kingdom was at 8. Ocarina of Time was at 2. And Breath of the Wild was at 1. So that means that the Legend of Zelda franchise makes up more than 1/10 of my overall top 50 games of all time, which is just absurd that one franchise, when there's so many great franchises out there, one franchise takes up so much real estate on my favorite games of all time. And, now as we look forward to the future of the Zelda franchise, we have no idea where we're going to go next. We got Echoes of Wisdom in 2024, but that felt a bit like a kind of mid-tier step into like a half step into what's next for the franchise when compared to kind of the massive scope of games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. But in 2023, I actually asked Aonuma about the future of the franchise and if Breath of the Wild was kind of the start of a new formula for the series, the way Ocarina of Time kind of established a new formula for games like, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess. And here's what Aonuma had to say. Quote, "With Ocarina of Time, I think it's correct to say that it did kind of create a format for a number of titles in the franchise that came after it. But in some ways, that was a little bit restricting for us. While we always aim to give the player freedoms of certain kinds, there were certain things that format didn't really afford in giving people freedom. Of course, the series continued to evolve after Ocarina of Time, but it's also fair to say now that we've arrived at Breath of the Wild and this new type of more open play and freedom that it affords. Yeah, I think it's correct to say that it has created a new kind of format for the series to proceed from." And, we've been talking a lot about the Zelda franchise, but I'll leave you and wrap up this episode with these quotes from Eiji Aonuma and Hidemaro Fujibayashi from my first interview with the two of them together in 2023. So these are going to be kind of longer quotes, but I asked each of them what they attribute to the long track record of success in the Legend of Zelda franchise. Here's Fujibayashi's thoughts. Quote, "Speaking from the development perspective, I think some of it has to do with the fact that we have a unique and diverse set of people in our teams, in that they all have different kinds of hobbies, sorry. It's not only just people who play games, and they have these hobbies that they enjoy, and they take that fun that they experience in their real lives, and they try to drop the essence of those elements into the games they create. Having that environment where they feel like they can freely develop and use their creativity to drop these into the games they're working on, I think plays a critical role in allowing for very diverse and unique games to be created." And then Aonuma's follow-up thoughts on that were, "When it comes to Nintendo's development, I think we have a bit of tenacity with the ideas that we come up with. So as you may be aware, Mr. Fujibayashi was the director of Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. And in this game, he had the desire to give Link the ability to seamlessly descend from the sky and then, after landing, kind of proceed from there. That was something that, given the time, he was unable to do. But I think that this idea is something that probably stuck with him and stayed in his head. When it came time to make games of a different kind and the type or the shape of the game might change those opportunities arise when you can find a way, when you can maybe from a different angle of that implementing that idea that you've kept with you all this time. This is something I think Mr. Miyamoto has said in the past, but when you have an idea and try to make it work and it doesn't work out, you don't give up on that idea. Instead, just wait for the right opportunity to arrive. Those ideas, and I think this is true of our developers, stick around in their heads. They keep them with them as they continue in their work. When those things pile up and the right opportunity presents itself, we find the right opportunity to implement those ideas. So, the Legend of Zelda franchise just continues to have this quality, this mark of quality as it goes through. And it continues to be one of the most beloved games in not only Nintendo's catalog, which, they have a robust catalog. I wouldn't be able to devote an entire podcast that is run for 231 episodes as of this recording without Nintendo having just a robust catalog. But I think even among Nintendo's robust catalog of incredible franchises, The Legend of Zelda stands out. I think it's like, Zelda and Mario are kind of in a league of their own in terms of just quality after quality after quality and the legacy that they instill in the industry. I think that it's fair to say that no other game in the industry, aside from maybe Mario and at this point maybe Pokemon, I would even say Zelda and Mario are above Pokemon in terms of inspiration, but it's up there in that legendary tier of franchises that, there are fewer than probably 5 franchises in all of gaming that can probably be mentioned alongside The Legend of Zelda in terms of influence and impact on the industry, and also a consistent mark of quality. Yes, there's been games that haven't done as well or haven't been as good or well received or haven't sold as well. But when you see that there's a new mainline Legend of Zelda game, you can probably have pretty good confidence that it is going to be an incredible title, regardless of what form that takes. And we've certainly seen that over the years with, the original game, A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, right into the rest of like the modern era of the Zelda franchise, and all the way up to games like Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and Echoes of Wisdom. And, I think that it's fair to say that, whenever a new Zelda game comes out, everybody is going to be excited for it. It's very rare that there is somebody who just outright does not enjoy the Zelda franchise. You might enjoy certain elements or certain gameplay types or certain games more and not like certain other ones as much. But I think that if you say The Legend of Zelda, almost everybody has a good or positive story or memory associated with it. And that's why celebrating it on its 40th anniversary is something I wanted to take a full episode to do here. So thank you so much for joining me for this episode of All Things Nintendo. I hope you enjoyed this retrospective. This is a franchise that means a lot to me, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. As you know, my Patreon and the associated Discord server are the best ways to get any questions or comments in, also the best way to support this podcast. But you can also get in touch with me at brian@allthingsnintendo.com or hit me up on Blue Sky or Instagram at Brian P. Shea. But for now, that is our show for this week. Thank you again so much for listening. Take care. We'll see you next time. Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening to this episode of All Things Nintendo. I hope you enjoyed the show. Before we wrap up here, I just want to give a special thank you to the $10 patrons of this podcast. Alex Stadnick, Andy Junkins, Ben Richland, Chad Brecky, Chaps My Ass, Derek Sigmund, Dusty Beeman, Ian T. Clark, Jawar Hello, Johnny Five, Jose Villalobos, Joshua DeProy, Casey Radio Man, Cody Gibson, Creeper 207, Ozman83, Paul at Drunk on Mako, Pratable, Rob McCann, Bobby Mac 265, Robert Sosa, Roberto Nieves, Roger Reichert, Russell Sayer, Smithy Poo, Zane Sink, and Zek 3 Sword Sama. Thank you so much for your continued support of this show. I could not do it without you.
Every hero strikes out on their adventure for a different reason.
To prove myself worthy of my mother's praise.
To write my own story and discover who I really am.
To prove to my family that I am more than they believe me to be. To revive the god that has chosen me.
But when the fragile balance of the world is in jeopardy, and sinister forces move in the darkness, heroes will be tested, pushed to their limits and beyond. And it will be left to them to determine if they are up to the task. There is a darkness rising. Will they be able to overcome the challenges and meet this evil head-on?
For my god.
For my story.
For my freedom.
For the world.
To restore the balance. Modified Role Season 2, The Chronicles of Erin, a D&D 5e actual play podcast. New season, new characters, new story. Find us on all the usual podcasting apps or at modifiedrole.com.